It's story time. The story begins. The words enter your mind. Neurons fire away deep into Imagination Central. There, any adventure can play out. Waves of blooming wildflowers roll in a light breeze. Butterflies flutter across the field, drifting up into the sky on a bright summer morning. You build a Persian palace from shadowy memories. Inside, sitting on his ottoman in flowing silk robes, a sultan speaks to his emissary, his eyes drawn thin as he issues a challenge to his people to bring him a riddle he cannot solve. You enter Storyland. Now you turn your heightened focus to today's storyteller.
Hello, my name is Charlotte Roe, and I'm with the Longmont Library Spellbinders. And the story I'm going to tell you today is a true story. I'm here to tell you about a great American heroine. Her name was Wild Horse Annie. She was the bravest, most powerful woman you could imagine. She was small, and she was partly disfigured by a terrible disease. But she spoke to the American people like thunder, and she made the biggest change anybody could have imagined. Her real name was Velma Johnston. And Velma was born in 1916 to a family on a small ranch near Reno, Nevada, when Reno was just a tiny city with mostly countryside. She was the eldest of 4 children. Velma had a lot of responsibilities on the farm, and she took them up with gusto. She loved all animals. She loved wildlife. She loved fashion. She was quite a fashionista in her day. She was a beautiful young woman, a beautiful young girl, and she had tons of friends. But most of all, she loved horses, and she respected them. Now, Velma's dad used to say that Mustang blood ran through his whole body. And here's the story about that. You know, Mustangs were the name given to horses that the Spanish conquistadores brought when they came to find gold in America, in North America where we live, and in South America. And when they were done, the horses got free, and so they roamed both continents. In America, in North America, where we are, there were millions of horses roaming the countryside at the time Velma lived. Well, her dad, when he was just a tiny boy, a tiny infant, his parents had to move to California because work dried up around Reno. And so they took a covered wagon, and they had 2 Mustangs tied to it for spares. Well, in the desert, Velma's mom's milk, her grandmother's milk gave out. And so her dad survived by taking milk from the mare. Now, the Mustangs had one great enemy, and that was man. At the time Velma lived, they were hunted by airplane. They were shot wherever people could shoot them. They were sold and ground up for pet food. It was a terrible situation. But it was remote to Velma. She knew about it, but at that time it was remote. Well, children at that time had their own terrible enemy. It was called polio, poliomyelitis. And Velma's family couldn't afford to buy the vaccine that was just coming out to protect children against it. When she was 11, she got polio. They had to ship her to California alone by railroad to Children's Hospital in San Francisco, because that was one place that would take children from families of little resources. And she was put in a cast from head to her hips with just little tiny holes for breathing for 6 months. It was agonizing. She missed her family. She didn't know she'd ever see them again. But she was tough, because she knew if she cried, it would make her itch so bad in that cast. Well, when they finally took the cast off and she finally got to get home, her body was twisted and one side of her face drooped terribly because of the experience in the cast. So this very popular girl, when she went back to school, it was agonizing. All of her friends, most of them disappeared. They didn't know how to relate to her. And bullies taunted her. They said, "Here comes Hump." But Velma was tough. She was a survivor. She used her wit and her love of fashion and her deep, warm, lustrous voice to get what she wanted. And she managed to reach her dreams. Her dreams at the time were to have a professional job. She became an executive secretary to a very important firm, insurance firm in Rio. And she married the dream she had, which was to marry someone who loved horses only a little bit less than he loved her. And he was a tall, handsome cowboy named Charlie Johnston. He was half Delaware Indian, and he was a real kind person, and he loved horses. Well, one day the situation of the Mustangs, which was remote to Velma, it came home. It came through her like a sword. She was driving to work, and a trailer just in front of her was dripping blood. She wanted to find out what was going on, and she asked the man, "What's happening? What's in there?" And she could see through the window these agonized faces of horses, little foals that were being crushed to death. They were packed like sardines, and many of the horses were near death. The man told her they were going to slaughter, and he was taking them to a holding pen. So she wrote down where that was. And the holding pens that kept the Mustangs that were going to slaughter were called kill pens. So that night after work, when Velma got home, she told Charlie all about it. And they went out to that place. And they opened the gate and let those horses free. And from then on, she created a big underground network that would tell her when this was happening to horses and where they were going. And she and Charlie went out, sometimes driving all through the night. They released a lot of horses. But they were just two people, and they couldn't solve the problem by themselves. Well, Velma kept building support. She built a big network. And one day, one of the only friends she had after she got polio in high school came and looked her up. He was an elected official then, and he wanted to help her save the Mustangs through the political process. So Velma got political. She was working at a time when few women, this was in the 1950s, were accepted in any kind of leadership role. So she knew she'd have to rely on the cold facts. She documented everything she could about the situation of those Mustangs and the abuse that happened to them. She and Charlie would go out and they'd photograph them. Well, people would hunt them till they were exhausted, and they would rope them to a huge tire and then pull them by a pickup until they were nearly dead and load them onto the trucks. She got news reporters with her photographs to write stories. There were few animal welfare groups active at that time. It was just starting. But she called them and she wrote them. She spoke to people, and above all, she spoke to schools. And she got school children involved in the cause. In 1959, what's called the Wild Horse Annie Act was passed by the Congress. And it said you couldn't use any motorized vehicles or helicopters or anything to round up the horses. But there was no teeth in the law. There was nothing to enforce it. And there were no fines or penalties. So she kept working. Well, soon enough, her husband, who was her great support, Charlie, died. And Velma was all alone. And believe me, the work she was doing was very tough and treacherous. The enemies sometimes said they'd like to see her locked up in a box of horse meat that was pet food. And sometimes when people came to the door, she'd have to have a gun by her side, because this was the Wild West and she was changing the rules. Well, Velma went on in spite of being alone. She moved in with her mother in Reno, and she kept working. And in 1971, the Wild, Free-Roaming Horse and Burros Act was passed, and it did have teeth. And it said that the Mustangs and the wild burros were to be protected like an integral part of the West. And that was Annie's dream. It wasn't just to save the horses. She used to say, "I'm fighting for a memory," because she wanted to restore them to their real place as part of the American legend. The act also said that there would be research to develop ways, humane ways to manage the Mustangs and the burros. Ways that wouldn't be invasive, ways that would be minimal. Well, the enemies still fought back. And twice they amended the act to bring back the helicopters and even to put slaughter back in the act. And so it was a tug-of-war with the Congress. And Annie died about that time. She died in 1977. She died early. But her legend lives on. You know, she mobilized as many school children to write letters to Congress as happened during the whole Vietnam War protest period. And her legend lives on today because there are grassroots organizations, 3 places in Colorado and many others throughout the West, that work to adopt those herds like their own family. They go out and they monitor them, they inventory, and they make sure that they can stay on the range, but it's not in every place. And the Mustangs and the wild burros are really threatened today. Wild Horse Annie used to say that her greatest achievement, though, it wasn't the legislation. It was what was called the Pencil Revolution. Her reaching the children who learned about civic participation. And what she used to say, that was like touching a star, to get involved in that way and see that you could do good things. And she lives on today in those animals that are untamed on the range, and through everybody who makes it their mission to do something for them. So you have to ask yourself, if you were driving behind that trailer, what would you have done? And would you take the time to go and see those wild horses and burros where they are, all throughout the West? It's not easy to see them. It's like catching the wind. But when you do, you'll know what's moving Wild Annie's heart. Thank you. My second story is called The Black Mare. This is a story, a folklore story from Venezuela, and it was first told to me by a Scottish harpist who learned it from a Mexican harpist, and then it came around to me. And this is my version of The Black Mare. In the Llanos, which are the great plains of Venezuela, situated between the mountains and the sea, there was a small town, and the town lived from raising cattle Now, where there are cattle, there are horses. And in that town lived a young woman whose name was Rayanara. She had black hair, black like a raven, long black hair. And she was quiet most of the time. She loved animals, and she was always kind to people, especially the elderly. But the women of the town mistrusted Rayanara because she was different, because of her silences, and because of her strange beauty. Well, Rayanara spent her time gentling horses and training them so people could ride them. And she knew how to talk to the horses. What the women of the town thought, it didn't really bother her, because she was one with the horse nation. And they accepted her like one of them. Well, in the town, there was also a group of cowboys who were called llaneros. And Ramon was the lead llanero. And every spring, they would go up to the mountains, and they would find the wild horses, or horses that had become wild, because sometimes at the end of the season, for the cattle, for rounding up the cattle, they would let the horses go, and they would become wild again. So Ramon and his friends were going up to the hills to round up the horses. And it was going well. They were getting the horses they needed. But one mare, a cold black mare, would not be caught for anything. She moved like the wind, and they ran their horses and ran their horses trying to catch her. And finally the other llaneros, the other cowboys, gave up. But Ramon could not. Something was pulling him towards that black mare like an invisible rope. So he kept going and going. And she ran up through the hills and then ran down. And finally she went into a small woods called a bosque. Well, Ramon and a llanero friend of his went through the woods, but they couldn't find her. Well, the others set themselves around so that she would be surrounded, and Ramon walked through the woods alone. He didn't see the horse. He didn't see the black mare, but he saw Rayanara, and she was leaning by a tree, just like she was worn out, completely worn out. Ramon looked at her and he said, "Did you see any horse come through here?" She said, "No, no horses. No horses came through here." Ramon looked at her and he had a suspicion. Maybe she was the black mare. And just at that time, like she was reading his mind, she said, I was gathering mushrooms. I got tired. Well, Ramon said, "I'm going to have to take you to the police so you can talk to the police chief and the priest, and we'll see what they say." And just like she'd read his mind again, Rayanara said, "No, no, 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 no. Kill me if you must. I'd rather die than be a prisoner." Well, Ramon thought about it, and he thought and thought. He saw, even if she's a witch, what harm is she doing if she can become a horse sometime? What harm is she doing? "All right, I'll set you free." And Rayanara said, just like she was reading his mind, "If you set me free, I promise you, you'll always catch the horse that you need." Well, from that time on, Ramon did have more luck catching the fastest wild horses. And he only caught the ones that he really needed. And he became more gentle with the horses. It's like the horses and he could read each other's mind. But at night, he would sometimes run with that Black Mare. And he was a little bit haunted by her. But he knew that he and Rayanara, or the Black Mare, could only be together like they had been on the edge of the Llanos, on the edge of time.